Hello, Twitch chat, YouTube, welcome to the latest edition of Everything About Vintage. This time we're going to do a metagame report before the Super PTQ on 2/6/2022. So we have a Super PTQ coming up, and we're going to do a quick look at what is getting played in the metagame. This won't be a comprehensive overview of the decks. If you want to see that, make sure you check out my video from before Eternal Weekend. It's usually the main video on my YouTube channel. You can check out that, and it shows you all kinds of decks and how they win. This is going to be very specifically looking at what is being played right now and what is winning. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us through a couple different snapshots of data, and we're going to see how it's progressed over the past 7 months or so. So we do have data starting in 2021 January, but I think the data is only really useful after Modern Horizons 2 gets printed. I think Urza Saga really did change vintage format pretty drastically. The way decks play against each other and the way the metagame and the matchups shape up is very different, just due to how much play Saga sees. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of the data since Modern Horizons 2, and then we're going to look at snapshots 135 days out, 90 days out, and 45 days out. I wanted to do 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, but 30 days just doesn't have enough data for it to be particularly useful. As we start to get lower in these day counts, the data is going to be very small because one, it's vintage, and two, there's not much data out there. So you always have to look at this data with that in mind, that we don't have a lot of data. So it's just showing you trends. It's not showing you absolutes. And that's even true for our highest section of data, which is 30,000 matches, which is actually just not that much. It's a lot for vintage because normally you don't see like almost any data, but for in the general scheme of numbers, not that high. So let's just try to bang this out as quick as we can so I don't make it an hour-and-a-half video. Looking at all of our data since Modern Horizons 2, you're going to see a very balanced metagame. This is what you're looking at here. You're looking at like the highest win percentage being Breach at 55%, Hogak at 54%, Pio 53%, Squee and Tinker at 52-ish. You got 8 casts here and 52-ish. But nothing is like jumping off the charts. Even Breach at 55%. Breach is just not seeing enough play for you to be 100% certain that it's 55%. It's probably somewhere between 58 and 52. There's also an issue I will point out with Breach is I'm not 100% sure how accurately we're calculating Breach's win percentage. One of the biggest problems is the way we categorize Breach is any deck that plays Breach gets categorized as Breach. And sometimes decks will play Breach, but we'll never see a Breach in a replay. So if the deck goes in 0-2 and we never see a Breach, we'll probably classify it as other Tinker if we saw like the Tinker elements. And there are decks that play 1 Breach, 1 Brain Freeze in their Tinker, Saga deck. So I think it would be wise to say that Breach is probably a little lower. I don't know how much lower, maybe 54, 53. But there's like very few dedicated Breach decks and very few dedicated Breach pilots, so it's a little hard to say sometimes. But for the rest of this, like you do have Bug and Golos, which is actually, you'll see that number drop way off in the short term. But in the long term, since Modern Horizons, Bug, Golos, Tinker are your big three. Followed by P.O. Dredge, Doomsday, and then a bunch of other things at about half as much as Bug. If you look like at the highest level and you're just looking at Tinker versus Bazaar versus Shops, you are going to see that Tinker has had a great time since Modern Horizons 2, but so has Bazaar. So like these numbers are actually really nice to look at. Like looking at these numbers and just looking at those numbers, that I would of course recommend decks like Gak, Ravager, Breach, any of the Tinker decks. But I think we'll definitely see some changes as we push closer to today's date, because the metagame has changed quite a lot since the initial Modern Horizons 2 meta. In the initial Modern Horizons 2 meta, you saw a lot of Golos and no Ravager. Now you're seeing almost no Golos and a lot of Ravager. So let's go change the date to 135 days ago. That is going to be September 20th of 2021. And we're going to lose about half of our data. We're at 17,000 matches. What kind of changes can we see? This is actually the first time I've looked at this, so I'm going to just be reacting as I see it. You're still seeing Tinker as the most played, but you're seeing a slight drop off in the amount of prison that's been played. Bug, and you're seeing you're seeing Dredge pop up into this top 3, top 4 area. What are we looking at for win rates though? Still have Breach sitting around 55%, but you also have Hogak around 55%. Dredge, PO, and Ravager shooting up to 53. In Ravager is only it's the 6th most played deck at 53%. That's a pretty big increase once you cut off the first 3 months of Modern Horizons 2, where people were figuring out the metagame. Since then, Aggro Shops has been, I shouldn't say at Ravager, that's just shorthand. Aggro Shops contains both Ravager decks and decks that play Null Rod and no Ravager. But for the most part, they typically play Ravagers. You're seeing like Golos is starting to really drop in win rate down to 47%. And Tinker's still holding pretty strong up here. As you see these trends, you'll probably start to see Tinker go down and Golos go down as decks like Ravager and Gak go up. That's what I expect to see. So we're looking here, we're seeing all 3 Dredge decks since September have been performing extremely well. Really, really high win rates for all 3 Bazaar decks. Sorry. This is the shift towards Ravager instead of Golos. And then you're still seeing all your Tinker decks perform well, but obviously this just this other blue Tinker, which contains like Ragavan Hullbreacher, Hullbreacher Wheels, basically all those like Saga decks. They were good for a little while, but then they started to start winning less as people adapted to them, got used to them. And though decks like PO started to see more wins as those decks fell. So interesting here to see this. What's Bug look like? Bug looks pretty rough. I kind of expected that. Doomsday has had a bit of a hard time adjusting to Saga metagame. Saga decks have a nice tool in Urza Saga against Doomsday where they can hold open Flusterstorm and then make a threat at the end of turn. That does make it harder for Doomsday. That doesn't mean Doomsday is a bad deck. Doomsday is still putting up, top 8s, and it's still a deck that's performing above 50%. But it is tougher for Doomsday when there are a lot of Tinker decks running around, a lot of Saga decks specifically. Let's chop off 45 days and let's look at the last 90 days. So the last 3 months of vintage on Magic Online. So this is starting from about the beginning of November of 2021. We're down to 14,000 matches. And what do we see? Do we see anything different in the last, removing the 45 days between those two? Very similar things. We're seeing Bug taking dips. We're seeing Dredge popping up pretty high right here. It's about the same on the Tinker. Prison Shops continues to fall. 8cast fell a bit as well. Jeskai just has not seemed to adapted to Modern Horizons 2 very well. And Doomsday took just a small dip in Doomsday. But here you can really see Bazaar is the best performing archetype in the last 90 days by like a significant amount. And this isn't just like Hogak. This is Dredge, Hogak, and Squee are all performing very high. Very high. These are high numbers for vintage. Now, of course, you need to take note. This is only 64 people have played GAC in the last 90 days. So like, this is this could be closer to 52% win rate. However, that's still not bad. When you're this high, it's usually a good sign. And now I think the last thing I want to check is just the last 45 days, so month and a half ish. So this is just going to be the second half of December and all of January. Only 5,000 or so matches. And what do we see? This is just the most recent stats. These are the most volatile stats because there's just not very many of them. But this is what people have been playing in the last 45 days on Magic Online. The most played decks are actually Ravager is the most played deck in the last 45 days, followed by Tinker, and then PO, Bug, Dredge, and then a couple, then the rest of the characters. Now, Tinker is still the most played archetype because there are multiple Tinker decks. However, the single most played deck is actually Ravager Shops. No, there's no data from leagues. This is only premier events. So you're seeing showcases, PTQs, mana traders, and challenges. You're seeing, yeah. So right now, this is actually just 13 challenges in a showcase because there wasn't any PTQs or qualifiers in the last 45 days. But here, you're seeing the two best performing archetypes in the last 45 days are Tinker and Bazaar. Could have probably told you that without looking at data. But you're seeing like very high win rates for PO and very high win rates for GAC. The best two decks going into the Super PTQ are definitely PO and GAC. GAC just came off a showcase win, multiple showcase top 8s, multiple challenge top 8s. Going into this weekend, I would absolutely say GAC is the deck to beat, followed behind by PO. Both of those decks have been performing at the highest level, basically. However, you, of course, need to be able to beat Ravager Shops because Ravager Shops is the most played deck. The deck that's performing the best isn't necessarily the deck that you need to beat because maybe you don't see it as much. However, it's hard to say. GAC could shoot up in popularity as people are seeing how much it's winning. It's really hard sometimes to predict what people are going to net deck. Vintage is a format that some people don't play very often. So when they're joining a PTQ or a showcase, they're going to pick up whatever looks like it's doing well. So you might see a pretty big rise in GAC for this weekend. You might see a pretty big rise in PO. You almost always see a pretty big rise in PO because PO is a very vintagey deck. Feels very powerful and very interesting. The problem with Breach is, like, Breach is doing well. I mean, it's doing fine in the last 45 days, but over the whole course, Breach is doing well. However, there's no consensus Breach build. There's a very cut and dry consensus GAC deck. You copy no props list, you can change like 3 or 4 cards, it's done. There's no Breach deck there. You're like, this is the right Breach deck. You could play a Tinker Breach, you could play a 6-emp Lelia Breach, you can play a Luris Breach, and no one knows what the best Breach build is. But people know what the best GAC build is. People have a decent idea of what the best PO builds are. However, PO has a lot of customization points. You can build PO in a lot of different ways. If you like really wanted to beat other PO players, you can play things like Lavinia and Teferi. You can play things. We were actually talking about things weird things like Counterbalance. I think PO like has some good builds that you can take, but it's not super clear what the best build is. GAC has a very cut and dry best build, and then Breach has a wide open field on whatever the best build is. So, yeah, maybe that's even more. I was thinking sideboard cards, but it's probably tough to change too much from the GAC list. It doesn't have very many flex slots. It usually has like 2 or 3 flex slots in the main from the last time I was playing with GAC. But there, that's what you have it. That's what's being played recently on Magic Online. The things that are being played, they're right here, and anyone can go to this list. I'm gonna give this link into the YouTube link. I will provide this in the description or the comments, or the description or the comments. What I recommend you do is that you take this link and you make a copy, in your own workspace. And what that will let you do is this is normally a lockdown page, so you can't change the date. But if you make your own copy, you can change the date. You can look at this. You can look at the leaderboard. You can see who's playing the most, who's playing the best. And you can even search like very specific things. Like, let me look at all of the dredge decks, or all of the Bazaar decks, or maybe all of the decks played by Canister. All of this information is there for people to access. It's public. So you can do that if you didn't get enough information from this video. I also think in this video, I should definitely shout out the data collectors. It's not just me who's doing this. There are a bunch of people who every time a challenge happens, they will stay after the challenge and fill out sheets and watch replays and take notes and fill in those decks so that we have the data on what is being played and what's doing well. So I'm not going to be able to name them all, but you got to shout out to people like Senpai Blank, like Eric, like Tim, Veritex. Yeah, I said Falcon Eye. I said Dan. There's a ton of people. Alet, who do data for the community, and so I wanted to do a big shout out to them as well. Yeah, Kevin as well. So yeah, that's going to be the end of this video. Hope this gives you enough information going into the PTQ to help make your decision on what deck you should play. I have some interesting ideas in the metagame. I think I might play a very interesting deck on Sunday, but I haven't decided yet. I hope you'll stop by Sunday and see if I do actually register it, because I think it'll be pretty interesting if we do. Great. Have a great weekend and good luck at the PTQ.